RevolutionRadio.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Hey, thanks, Nighthawk. Miss you, pal. You're back with David Mackey's Shiny Side Out on Revolution Radio, the #1 listener-supported talk radio on the net. So, push the donate button on the station's website and subscribe to the archives. They are free, which is really cool. Get yourself some great merchandise from the station's website. Also, you know, it could be a t-shirt, a mug, or anything like. Just all the artwork's done by Amad Painter, who is one of the original hosts, still with Revolution Radio, thank goodness. I've been on his show, he's been on mine. Good fellow. Honest art. You'll be amazed at it. So do that, and I'm going to thank you all for listening to Revolution Radio. It's been a very long time. We've been here since I think 2012 or thereabouts, his 13th year or thereabouts. Math is a little hard over this such a long time. It's 662 shows in today, and we are talking about medical experiments. This is part 2. If you've just they've got the wrong title on there. There we go. It's better. Yes. So if you're worried that you've missed anything, yes, you have. You've missed last week's show, and you can catch that up either in the archives or you can find it on YouTube. And if it gets banned from YouTube, then it'll be on Rumble. That's that easy. Oh, it just makes things better. We were thinking about streaming or turning this into both a radio show and a podcast. Maybe do something on X, maybe. We never want to slander anyone. We have no intention of saying anything wrong. We're not medical experts. We are just people who do research, and we bring out the research to everybody. And it's always evolving. And our sources we cite every source we have, and our opinions are said seldomly throughout the shows. Usually of surprise or horror or excitement, depending on what we're talking about. But in this case, since we're talking about human medical experiments, and it's being part 2, we are very careful that we don't do any of that. Exhibiting shock is fine, or surprise. That's pretty much where I'm going to leave it. Anywho, knowing the history, you'll catch up with it from last week. But I want to say, being show 662, if Meki were here, he would say 260 and 600. That's the way his mind works, and appreciate everything that it brings to the show. Sadly, he can't be with us. He might join us this hour, but look, there's a storm coming, and I don't want him rushing back and facing the terrible conditions. Let me just put that up on the screen for a sec. So there's a huge front coming through. I don't see any hooks anywhere, but it's certainly going to dump a whole bunch of rain, and it's going to be about another hour or so before it gets to me, so happy days. All right, let me commence with the show notes, and we're 14 pages in of 77, so this is going to go for maybe 6 or 7 shows. In this news article from the 24th of July 2019, Frank Swain, he's the features correspondent. He wrote the headline, "Is it right to use Nazi research if it can save lives?" And there's a Getty Images here. This is from his article, courtesy of Getty Images. Several German scientists pictured who helped to send NASA's Apollo missions to the moon had previously worked on the V2 rockets for the Nazis. And that's true. That was Operation Paperclip, where the spoils of war was scientists. and both Russia and the US, whoever they found went this Operation Paperclip, they were given a new life in America to work for NASA, and it created NASA, by the way. The story continues. It says, from the Apollo rockets to new drugs to treat HIV, some scientific advantages are obtained in dubious ways. Should we make peace with using their findings? Seeking a local angle on the 50th anniversary of the moon landings this week, when the author wrote this back in the 24th of July 2019, Washington, D.C. news station WTOP published a glowing biography of the brilliant rocket scientist Wernher von Braun, who was laid to rest in nearby Alexandria in 1977. The article caused uproar, however, and was swiftly retracted. The reason? It had failed to mention that von Braun was a Nazi. He did the science for the Nazi Party, but whether or not he was directly a Nazi or not is not for me to comment on. The author says there are few corners of scientific progress that are not tainted at some point in their history by immoral or unethical behavior. Physics, biology, zoology, medicine, psychology, vaccine science, anthropology, genetics, nutrition, engineering, says the author, are all rife with discoveries made in circumstances that can be described as unethical, even illegal. However, how should we feel about making use of that technology, that knowledge, especially when it could be of great service to civilization and even save lives? Von Braun's presence on the Apollo program was no outlier. More than 120 German scientists and engineers joined him there, including fellow SS officer Kurt Dubus, who became director of NASA's Launch Operations Center, and Bernard Tessman, designer of the colossal vertical assembly building at what is now Kennedy Space Center. There were among 1,600 scientists recruited, I'll fix that in post. All those mistakes you hear me say, I'll fix in post, but I never will. By spies as part of Operation Paperclip, there we go, at the end of World War II. I was right. Crowd goes wild. Or if I'm going to steal the line correctly, the sedate Narara crowd goes wild. That's a steal from, what was it called with Bill Murray? Or the golfing one? Someone in the chat room help me out. All shielded from prosecution, given safe passage to the US and allowed to continue their work. Allied forces also snapped up other Nazi innovations, nerve agents such as Tubin and sarin, which would fuel the development of new insecticides as well as weapons of mass destruction. The anti-malarial chloroquine, methadone and methamphetamines, as well as medical research into hypothermia, hypoxia, dehydration and more, were all generated on the back of human experiments in concentration camps, says the author. I'm sure they're not citing their examples here, but it must be well-known knowledge that is what it is. Now, hang on, just a ruthless bad says Gona blacktopia, flip-flopia, then asphaltia. Right, so the asphalt on the road, and flip-flops, we call them thongs here. That would mean for me that the ground is so hot that the bitumen in the asphalt, it gets sticky and will retain your flip-flop or thong in like glue and you'll step out of it by ruining your thongs. Fake audience cheers. Bad job too. All right. Particle board, forms of synthetic rubber, and the soft drink Fanta were also developed by the Germans under Nazi rule. Yeah, that's true. An aside. So, my daughter likes Fanta. I think she's into iced tea now. But when she was younger, she liked Fanta. And I said, that's Nazi cola. She goes, what? What are you talking about? And I said, well, Fanta, because the cola brands, both brands, weren't available to Germany during the war, they decided to make their own soft drink. And they made, or soda, if you will, they made their own one from what they had available to them, and that was orange colouring, artificial colouring. So they made Fanta. And I thought that was great. At least they taught us something, that she could use. Now, there's also from the article that the person posted, there's a Getty image here of Wernher von Braun. There, I think it's taken. It's an original NASA photo anyway. So Wernher von Braun was one of the number of German scientists who were recruited by the Allies at the end of World War II. But this was far from a one-off injection of unethical research into the scientific record. For 40 years, starting in 1932, researchers at Tuskegee University in Alabama tracked the progress of syphilis in hundreds of poor black men, says the article, none of whom were ever given a diagnosis or treatment, despite the antibiotic penicillin, which could cure the disease, being available at the time. In a related study, US doctors in the 1940s intentionally infected unsuspecting patients with a sexually transmitted infections to study the diseases. Conscious of the outcry this might generate, the experiments were performed in Guatemala. US doctors in the 1940s intentionally infected unsuspecting patients with sexually transmitted infections to study the diseases. From 1955 to 1976, in what became known as the unfortunate experiment, hundreds of women with precancerous lesions were left untreated to see if they developed cervical cancer. Details of the study only came to light following an expose by two women's health advocates, Sandra Coney and Felida Bunkel. The New Zealand study hoped to test theories about the value of early intervention, but a later inquiry into the research by Judge Sylvia Cartwright criticised the treatment of patients by the doctors running the study. Now, it's important to remember, in last week's show, we read through the oath, the Hippocratic Oath, and its generations, how it's evolved into what it is today. We read those out so that you have to understand that the doctors must have been operating under those rules. The polio vaccine and many other medical advances besides owes its existence to human cells that were taken from Henrietta Lacks without her knowledge or consent, and who never saw any compensation from their commercialization. The cell line grown from those initial samples have been used in countless research into drugs, toxins, viruses, and also have been used to study the human genome. And in the 1950s, Robert G. Heath pioneered the use of electrodes implanted in the brain, in one case attempting to rewire sexual orientation. Today, similar technology is used as a treatment for epilepsy, Parkinson's disease, and Elon Musk's recently announced neural lace. It is not controversial to argue that these experiments should never have happened, but now they have. What should be done with the information they generated? The basic institution, this is a quote by Don Wilkinson, the basic intuition is that if information had been obtained unethically, but we use that information, then we become complicit in that past. A medical ethicist at the University of Oxford, Don Wilkinson. This is a common view even among those who make use of such findings. Writing in the bioethics journal, the Hastings Center report in 1984, Christine Moe recounts a conversation with John Hayward, a leading expert in hypothermia at the University of Victoria, British Columbia, who used Nazi data in his studies. And I'm quoting John Hayward. "I don't want to have to use this data, but there is no other and will be no other in an ethical world," he told her. "I've rationalized it a little bit, but to not use it would be equally bad." But Hayward's experience was unusual. I think it's important to say that these findings very rarely provide key important information in isolation, says Wilkinson. For the most part, scientific information is like a piece in a jigsaw. It fits into an overall puzzle, unquote. Wernher von Braun's contributions to the Apollo space program may have been considerable, but it's impossible to say whether NASA could have not figured out how to land on the moon without his help, and the knowledge he obtained while working on the Nazi V-2 rocket program, had he not had that. Meanwhile, the results of the Tuskegee and unfortunate experiments did not drastically change our understanding of syphilis or cancer. The data is not so useful that we must hold our noses and put it into practice to help patients today. Wilkinson continues, he says, "There are lots of other observational studies that see what happens if you don't treat cervical cancer," says Wilkinson. "But even if you said we don't use this bit of science, we wouldn't be at a different understanding of cervical cancer," unquote. It can be tempting, says the author, to think that unethical medical practices are a thing of the past, that modern medicine's tangle with immortality was an aberrant blip on the mid-20th century, and that as we move further from this time, the work performed then will fade into scientific irrelevance. From now on, we might tell ourselves, all of our data collection will be above board and our discoveries ethically sound. Unfortunately, says the author, this is not the case. One concern of using the data is that it expresses the attitude that this research was okay and encourages future researchers, says Don Wilkinson. Echoing the Guatemala syphilis studies, many clinical trials are to this day carried out in developing nations for arguably the same reasons. Regulations are more lax, and the risk of bad press from any negative outcomes is lessened. A 2008 report published by the Center of Research on Multinational Corporations revealed details of how many such unethical trials carried out in India, Nigeria, Russia, Argentina, and Nepal, among others. It revealed the unrecorded deaths of 14 women in Uganda during a trial of the anti-HIV transmission drug Nevirapine, It also revealed that 8 patients in Hyderabad, India, had died during the trial of anti-clotting drug skeptokinase, and that none of them were aware that they were part of an experiment. Now, onto a bad example. The urge to do some good with data, even if it was obtained in an unethical way, comes with its own problems. Aside from carrying the weight of complicity, does using the findings tell current and future researchers that it's better to seek forgiveness than ask permission? Wilkinson says here, there's something very particular about knowledge that is irreversible. You can't unknow something, says Wilkinson. One concern of using data is that it expresses the attitude that this research was okay and encourages future researchers. History will judge me positively. We want to not do that. We don't want to promote unethical research, he says, unquote. Wilkinson highlights a recent case of Chinese researcher who announced in 2018 that he had created the first gene-edited babies. It is a really striking example. It looks like he was motivated by the particular fame associated with being first, says Wilkinson. That view is echoed by the Health Commission of China, whose investigation into the research concluded that the scientist, end quote, Chinese Commission of Health, illegally conducted the research in the pursuit of personal fame and gain, unquote. Like other individuals who commit attention-grabbing crimes for notoriety, says Wilkinson, we should make efforts not to condone their behaviour or give them promotion they seek. But even if we can separate the actions of people from the science they generate, condemning one while doing some good with the other, we're still not out of the moral maze. What happens when the problematic research is yet to be done, but could be? That's the quandary posed by a controversial collection of blood samples from more than 3 million Scottish people, currently held in the National Health Service's Greater Glasgow and Clyde Health Board. The samples were collected as part of a routine heel prick test performed on all newborns to check for a number of genetic conditions. But from 1965 to 2003, permissions from parents was never sought about storing the blood samples, meaning that the entire database is legally dubious. As the world's oldest and largest collection of Guthrie cards, as the records are known, the database offers an uncommonly broad view of the nation's genetics and also represents a unique resource for medical researchers. But because of the issues surrounding how they were collected, there is currently a moratorium on carrying out research using these cards. There's a quote, "These kinds of situations are currently straightforwardly ethical or unethical. They involve competing ethical concerns, all of which need to be taken into consideration," says Anne Wilkinson, Program Officer at the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, who has written about Scotland's Guthrie cards. Important social benefits might be achieved by using the database, she says. Quote, "But this would not simply trump concerns about consent, privacy, risk to people associated with the use of their personal information, and respect for those people's views about its use." Health authorities in Scotland are now embarking on a consultation. Health authorities in Scotland are now embarking on consultations with researchers, ethicists, patients, and citizens about what should be done with the Guthrie cards. One option is to allow those opposed to opt out of being part of any research performed on the cards, but demonstrating that you adequately sought retroactive permission from the 3 million people is no small task. It's human nature to try to draw some good out of bad situations. Even in the Warsaw Ghetto, Mo notes, Jewish doctors made meticulous notes on their fellow residents, on their health, and the data which was smuggled out and later published as a landmark study on the effects of starvation disease. A decision to use the data should not be made without regret or without acknowledging the incomprehensible horror that produced them. She writes of Nazi research, "We cannot imply any approval of the methods, nor, however, should we let the inhumanity of the experiments blind us to the possibility that some good may be salvaged from the ashes." And I'm going to paste, let me see if I can paste that link into the chat room so the people in the chat room can understand the nature of this. And for those watching this on YouTube, you can type it out. I might put it into the show notes of in the comments below the video. Now this one is the AMA Journal of Ethics. This is from January 2021. This is a peer-reviewed paper, and it's titled, "How Should We Regard Information Gathered in Nazi Experiments?" The author is Arthur L. Kaplan, PhD. I'll read the abstract first. Immorally acquired information from Nazi experimentation or other sources infects the body of scientific and biomedical knowledge. Responding to this reality ethically means insisting on good teaching about the horrific history of such information sources and careful deliberation about how it is referenced and described. Ethically fraught information. I first, says the author, confronted the issue of the morality of using information obtained from heinous experiments when I was teaching medical ethics at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, in 1988. I received an email from Robert Pozos, then a physiologist at the University of Minnesota in Duluth, and a nationally known expert on hypothermia. Pozos wanted to know my opinion on using information from experiments conducted in the Dachau concentration camp. Nazi scientists had, he told me, used 300 to 400 inmates of the camp as human guinea pigs to determine how people survive or die in extreme cold. They killed about 80 prisoners, investigating brutal exposure. Inmates, mostly Poles and Russians, were held for hours in tanks of bitterly cold water or left standing naked in freezing weather. Some were frozen to death in attempts to learn how much cold a human could endure. Others were brought near death, then subjected to warming techniques, i.e. hot baths or body heat transference from cuddling female prisoners, to assess the possibility of recovery. Pozos told me, this is the author, that his own studies of cold exposure in human subjects, funded by the United States Armed Forces and private companies with operations in cold environments, had been conducted over many years with institutions, review and approval and subject consent. Responses to hypothermia available in the 1980s included out-of-body heart bypass to warm the blood, hot humidified air, and warm blankets. But Pozos' studies of hypothermia got nowhere near temperatures that would kill or nearly kill his subjects. Only the Nazis had gone that far, summarizing their findings in reports published in various places, including the Nuremberg war trials proceedings. Pozos thought information gathered in Nazi experiments had value and deserved conservation. So we agreed to hold a conference at the University of Minnesota to consider whether and how to use hypothermia information gathered at Dachau and to review the roles of medicine in the Holocaust. At the time, I was unaware of a seminal article published years earlier by a journalist which addressed many questions that interested us. Nevertheless, that conference was important. It was one of the first to examine Nazi experiments and a key factor in, this is the author, my researching and publishing my book. And the book title is When Medicine Went Mad, Bioethics and the Holocaust. Distinguishing applications, justifiability. During the conference, we considered, he says, a discovery I made, that's the author, that information gathered at Dachau about human beings' responses to hypothermia had been used by many military organizations in many nations, including the United States. It was cited in military circles right after World War II, during a national obsession with the perceived threat from the Soviet Union in preparations for a Cold War that might turn hot, i.e., what became the Korean War. Although it was not evident to me, the author, when Pozos reached out to me, I later appreciated that information believed by some to aid pursuit of war or national security, or to aid responding to perceived terrorist threats, presumably was deemed ethical, justifiable to use. Ethically justifiable to use. This rationale was offered by German scientists and physicians at the Nuremberg trials and by many others, but not by me, the author. Not me, but the author. Neither national security nor war justified torture or use of information gathered from torturous interrogation. Invoking national security as a reason to use information gathered from immoral research is naive. National security seemingly justified using information gathered by military psychologists who participated in interrogations using torture in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and in US prison in Abu Ghraib in Iraq. But neither security, national security, nor war justify torture or use of information gathered from torturous interrogation, nor do they either justify suspension of internationally agreed upon human subject research protections. However, some, including me, that's the author, 30 years ago, argued that if there is no other way to save a life or lives, prevent disability, or prevent intense suffering using immorally acquired information such as gathered about hypothermia in Dachau, is justifiable. The lessons. Knowledge. As I learned, the author, from studying the hypothermia experiments in Dachau, questions about using information gathered from grossly immoral experiments can easily morph into a debate about justifying past use or continued use, but not about that information's wider effects on knowledge or how we should orient ourselves to knowledge arising from empirical or ethically flawed sources, tainted information gathered by Nazis at Dachau, US Public Health Service researchers at Tuskegee, or others, tends to be used if it has practical application. But tainted information infects the body of scientific and biomedical knowledge, silently becoming a part of that body. The silent becoming, however, should be regarded as ethically and epistemically problematic when the immorality I can't read the word, of that information, immorality, it doesn't seem right to me. Immorality, there you go. I'll read it again. I'll fix it all in post. The silent becoming, however, should be regarded as ethically and epistemically problematic when the immorality of that information source or means of acquisition is subsumed, rendered invisible by the general legitimacy of that broader knowledge or the broader body of knowledge. Managing this reality responsibly and ethically requires insistence upon good teaching about the horrific history of its information's creation and careful deliberation about how it is referenced and cited in journals, books, exhibitions, clinical practice guidelines, award presentations, talks, and other sources. Application value. If information from Dachau hypothermia experiments was useless, then the need to debate when, how, and where it should be referenced would evaporate. Like posers, many believed that information gathered at Dachau had value, but others have argued that information gathered from sick, starving, and stressed subjects is of little, if any, scientific value. Reliance on better or alternative sources of information deemed useful has also informed discussion about using the Atlas of Topographical and Applied Human Anatomy, which depicts dissection studies on victims of Nazi atrocities and is as an anatomical reference. But alternatives to immorally sourced information do not always exist, as is the case for information gathered at Dachau from freezing emaciated persons to death. Yet, even when legitimate scientists argue persuasively that immorally sourced information has scientific value, ethical questions about that information's use persist. Moral standing. Some survivors of Nazi concentration camps who were alive in 1989 attended the conference we organised in Minnesota. Some were subjects in experiments other than the hypothermia experiments. Some were in concentration camps as children but were not experimental subjects, and some were children of Holocaust victims. Although not all victims of Nazi experimentation were Jewish religious authorities shared their views during the conference, as did research ethics scholars, American physicians, British physicians, and members of the media. Even the author sought the opinion of his own father, who, as a medic in the 45th Infantry Division of the 2nd Chemical Mortar Battalion, was among the troops who deliberated at Dachau camp. In 1989, the views of Holocaust survivors were seen as carrying substantial, if not extra, moral heft. As the survivors and witnesses died, their opinions seemed to be less often invoked, which suggests the importance of their written or recorded opinions about what they experienced and believed. Description. Questions about how to characterize information or its means of acquisition in Nazi camps had little influence on early debates about this information's use. But examples of important neglected questions that deserve consideration are these. Should observations of how people froze to death for example, by describing as information, as I've used the term in this article, findings, data, torture, facts, or something else? Should Nazi experiments, as I've been calling exposure or something else, as I've been calling them in this article, be called experiments, protocols, research trials, barbaric exposure, or something else? Should the camp personnel who administered or designed the experiments be called scientists, or German scientists, or Nazi scientists, or perpetrators, quacks, monsters, or something else? The language you use to represent what happened is ethically important for many reasons, including whether we place these nouns linguistically within or outside the scope of what we're willing to call biomedicine. If this enterprise is described as biomedical, its social and cultural authority and legitimacy are conferred upon what is described within this scope. So the normative significance of our descriptors underscores the importance of our obligations to be thoughtful, careful, and respectful in our word choices in this debate. The author says, my own view in this hypothermia experiments were conducted by expert German scientists who intended to create valid data for military application. So-called experiments in camps with other than Dachau were carried out by inept sadists to maim and torture and do not merit description as science even when carried out by physicians. The history of medicine reveals innumerable instances of mainstream clinicians and scientists doing horrific things with their best techniques of their time to do what they believed to be important science, to generate what they intended to be data, and to produce what they'd hoped would be useful applications. This history must be acknowledged if we are to grapple, as we should, with biomedicine's ethically fraught past. And I'm also going to paste this link into our chat room so they can make their own determinations from that article. And I do implore you to do the same. 15 minutes left, goodness me. I'll stop it where I need to. The Nazis were bad and probably represent the gold standard when it comes to cruelty and inhumanity. But they were not alone. Unethical human experimentation is human experimentation that violates the principles of medical ethics. Such practices have included denying patients the right to informed consent, using pseudoscientific frameworks such as race science, and torturing people under the guise of research. Around World War II, Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany carried out brutal experiments on prisoners and civilians through groups like Unit 731 or individuals like Josef Mengele. The Nuremberg Code was developed after the war in response to the Nazi experiments. Countries have carried out brutal experiments on marginalized populations. Examples include American abuses during Project MKUltra and the Tuskegee syphilis experiments and the mistreatment of indigenous populations in Canada and Australia. The Declaration of Helsinki, developed by the World Medical Association, back then the WMA, is widely regarded as the cornerstone document on human research ethics. The Empire of Japan. Human subject research in Japan began in World War II. It continued for some years after. Unit 731, a department of the Imperial Japanese Army located near Harbin, then in the puppet state of Manchukuo in northeast China, experimented on prisoners by conducting vivisections, dismemberments, and bacterial inoculations. It induced epidemics on a very large scale from 1932 onward through the Second Sino-Japanese War. It also conducted biological and chemical weapons tests on prisoners and captured POWs. With the expansion of the empire during World War II, similar units were set up in conquered cities such as Nanjing. This is called Unit 1644. In Beijing, Unit 1855. Guangzhou, Unit 8604. And Singapore, Unit 9420. After the war, Supreme Commander of the occupation Douglas MacArthur gave immunity in the name of the United States to Shiro Ishii, and all members of the units in exchange for all of the results of their experiments. The United States blocked Soviet access to this information. The Soviets prosecuted some of the Unit 731 members during its Khabarovsk war crimes trials. In November 2006, Dr. Ikiro Makino confessed to Kyodo News that he had performed surgery and amputations on condemned prisoners, including women and children. In 1944 and 1945, while he was stationed at Mindanao, there you go, most of Makino's victims were Moro Muslims. In 2007, Dr. Ken Yuasa testified to the Japan Times and said that he believes that at least 1,000 persons working for the Showa regime, included surgeons, conducted surgical research in mainland China. I'm going to pause it there and discuss something interesting that I found out. So this is going to be 663. So in Japan, at Nagasaki was the secondary site on the day of the dropping of the second nuclear weapon. It was the secondary site. The first site was clouded over and they diverted to the secondary site, and being Nagasaki. Now Nagasaki held a biological testing facility there, and they were planning to use against China the plague-infested fleas in sand in canisters that would be dropped over China and attempt to create a plague epidemic as part of warfare. Now, Japan and China weren't getting along. Japan owned some, occupied some territory in China, and it was game on. It could have been another war wiping out most of China, but the Nagasaki, the dropping of their nuclear weapon, the atomic bomb, actually, on Nagasaki, it destroyed the facility and all the records from this research facility where they'd had prisoners of war, Chinese prisoners of war, and they were put them into a sealed booth, slid a little piece across, and these plague-infected fleas would occupy that booth and they would observe the demise of the person over time. Look, it's shocking to me as all of these war crimes and all of this information that we've read out so far, and what I know is coming in the next show. But that the dropping of the weapon that destroyed the facility, unknowns to the world at the time, actually ceased that operation. So it's only happenstance. You can imagine if the primary target was hit instead and Nagasaki was left untouched, that may very well have then gone about and the project stood up and deployed. So yeah, you have to thank goodness that it happened, and when it did, and it just, I don't think there was any US intelligence that suggested that was happening. We only found out afterwards by those people who survived. Wow. World War II had, near the end of World War II, all sides clamouring to make innovations in conventional weaponry or anything in order to be able to secure any victories. The English made experimental devices, one which were these huge cartwheeling, like gigantic scale, rotational, firework driven, like, rocket driven, firework rockets, driven large wheels with explosives on them. And because there was no other way of propelling these large wheels through the mudflats of invading troops, that they could effectively start this large wheel moving, and the rockets would propel it such that it would advance on the troops coming towards you, the advancing troops. Eventually, by the length of fuse calculated, would blow up in their midst. They couldn't do anything about it. So, I mean, I'm talking maybe 30 meters tall. These things are crazy, and they weighed heaps. They were made of oak, not steel or anything. They're made of wood. So getting them moving was awkward, but worse still was you couldn't steer them. Today, you could make something that was steerable. You could possibly shoot it, possibly, as a large single thing that could destroy a bunch of troops. But you've got to worry that, steerable today means hackable. Steerable today means you could probably take it out with a shoulder-mounted rocket or something like that. The drones today are today's worth of research. There was even these incendiary bats that America had planned to try to use against Japan, that they'd be released from planes and fly down and rest in people's lofts. But the little incendiary anklet that they had on the bat would set fire to the people's wooden houses, and Japan would be on fire. Awful. The only thing that beats that is carpet bombing, but what are you going to do? So we're coming to the end of another Shiny Side Out for another week. We'll catch you next week. We'll also catch you 7 a.m. Eastern US time for Plato's Cave. We wake up with Plato's Cave in the morning. And coming up next is probably Jer Bear if he's back on deck, for another great show to join in, listen in, and enjoy it. And in the meantime, if Mackie was here, he would give you advice. Be safe.